At this point in the course, you of course already learned how you can extract user input from forms, for example with two-way binding or with help of template variables and with help of the ng-submit event to which you can listen, which is provided by Angular. We did already use these features in earlier course sections. But in this course section, we'll actually dive a bit deeper into managing forms, because it turns out that besides the approaches we took thus far, Angular actually offers two main ways of handling forms in Angular applications, if you want to call it like this. It has two main approaches you might want to use, which allow you to do more than just extract entered values. And that would be template-driven forms and reactive forms. So managing forms in Angular applications in a template-driven or reactive way. And we'll take a closer look at these two different approaches in this section, and you will of course learn how to use them and how to manage your forms with these approaches. We'll explore how you can manage form inputs, how you can extract user input values, and how you can also validate those inputs and make sure that only valid values are accepted and used. And therefore, for this section, I prepared another starting project, which you find attached as always. And after downloading it, you should of course run npm install once to install all dependencies. And then npm start to start that development server. And if you do that, you should then see a page like this on the screen. And it's now this basic login form with which we'll get started before we'll then also build a more complex form later in this section. But before we do any of that, I'll actually first give you a brief overview of the template-driven and reactive forms approach and why we have those two different approaches. So as mentioned, Angular has two main ways it gives you when it comes to handling forms. And of course, as you saw already, you don't need to use either of these two ways, or at least you don't have to use all the features these two different main approaches give you, because we have been able to handle user input in earlier course sections already without knowing anything about these two main ways. But as you're building more complex Angular applications and potentially also more complex forms, or as you want to do more than just extract values, you might be interested in using one of these two main ways. And when it comes to these two approaches Angular gives you, we, for example, have the template-driven approach. The idea here is that you set up your forms with help of the component templates and you register inputs with Angular so that it is aware of them with help of your templates, so directly in the templates. And therefore this approach, as you will see, is relatively easy to get started with, but it can also face some limitations, or it may get trickier as you're building more complex forms. Though ultimately, as always, it is of course up to you whether you want to use this approach or not. The alternative, about which you will also learn in this section, would be reactive forms, where you set up your form structure in your TypeScript code, and you then just link that to the template elements so that Angular knows which input element in the template is related to which control that was set up in the TypeScript code. And therefore, as you will also see, the setup step can be a bit more complex, can require more code, and is a bit more verbose. But the advantage can be that handling more complex forms may be easier than when using that template-driven approach. But of course, with that, this is all still relatively vague and unclear, I'd imagine. So therefore, let's simply dive right in and let's start with template-driven forms, and let's explore how you would manage this form here with help of this template-driven forms approach Angular offers you. So let's now manage this form here with help of template-driven forms. And for that, in this starting project, I'll go to the login component in that auth folder, because it's in that component that this form, which we see on the screen here, is set up, or that the markup for this form is set up, I should say. Because at the moment, this markup and also this login component does not include any code that would handle any user input. And that's of course ultimately what we want to do, though as you'll see, we'll actually do a bit more than that. We'll actually also make sure that we tell the user about errors, that we validate the user input, and some other things as well. Now, as I mentioned, I want to start by managing this form with this template-driven forms approach. And in the end, this approach, as you will see, is kind of related to how we managed form submissions thus far. You will see some similarities there, but you'll now understand how some of these features work together. Because when it comes to managing a form with this template-driven forms approach, it all starts here in the template. Because when using this approach, you let Angular know about your form and the input elements by adding special directives to some of these elements in the template. And that's also important to understand here. The end goal is to make Angular aware of this form and its inputs, so that you can then use Angular and some features it offers to you to easily interact with this form and, for example, extract the entered values, but also some other pieces of information. And therefore, let's start by making Angular aware of this email input field, let's say. And you would do that by adding a directive onto this input element, a directive which you already know, the ng model directive, but here without two-way binding. We could use two-way binding if we wanted to two-way bind this input, if we wanted to be able to overwrite the value entered there with help of two-way binding, but you don't have to use ng model with two-way binding. And that's of course something new which we haven't done thus far. Because up to this point in this course, we always used ng model with two-way binding, but it turns out that you don't have to use it with two-way binding. Because this ng model directive, in the end, registers an input element with Angular. And an input element doesn't have to be an input element as it's here. It could also be a text area or a select element or anything like that. So any kind of HTML input element, any HTML element that is about gathering user input. So ng model registers this element with Angular. It makes Angular aware of this input element, and it allows Angular to manage it behind the scenes, you could say. And it will also allow you to gain access to that element, as I'll soon show you. Now, in order to make ng model work here, though, we have to go to the login component TypeScript file and add the imports array there. Because just as before in this course, in order to make ng model work, you should add the forms module to this imports array. Because this will unlock this ng model directive and some other form related features as well. So with that done, you can go back to your website, and there you'll find an error in the developer tools console if you open that. There you'll find the error that ngModel must be used within a form tag, and then it must be used on an element that has the name attribute set on it. And currently that's not the case. I am in a form element, but this input element doesn't have the name attribute set on it. So that's something we have to do. And I deliberately did not do that in advance so that you really understand this and memorize this fact that you must add the name attribute to elements that do use ngModel. Because it's this name that will then internally be used by Angular to register this input element and to manage it, you could say. The name is up to you, and here I'll choose email since that makes sense for this input. With that name added here, if I save this error goes away though. And with that, we now registered this first input with Angular. Now, of course, we can do the same for the second input. And I'll give this a name of password here. But what's now the advantage of doing that? How does ngModel now allow us to get access to these input elements and learn more about them? Well, that's what we'll take care of in the next lecture.